So basically, he thinks capitalism has invaded every area of society and destroyed all the authenticity. Everything is fake. Your relationship is fake because the ring that you got from your wedding was just something that was picked because somebody wrote an advertisement. Your vacation was fake. All your food is fake, and the only reason you want to eat it is because you see a bunch of commercials. There was a reality, and that capitalism was selling you the appearance rather than the reality. The strawberry Slurpee, which is supposed to taste like a strawberry, replaces the idea of strawberry in my son's head. So now when my son thinks strawberry, he thinks the flavor of the Slurpee and not the actual organic strawberry.
I'm here with Wokal Distance. We've talked a couple of times, and we're going to talk one more time, or at least one more time, because we're going through postmodernism, some of the major figures of postmodernism. We've talked about Derrida and Foucault, and today we're going to talk about Baudrillard and a couple others. So let's get started. Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. So what we're going to do today, I hope, or I think we talked last time, and we were going to talk about Baudrillard.
Yes, Baudrillard.
Okay.
Is that what I said? I meant to say that.
Yes. Jean Baudrillard. He is a very interesting fellow, very, I don't know if enigmatic is the right word. So both, we talked last time, well, the first time we talked about Derrida, and the second time we talked about Foucault.
Yeah.
Both of those guys were trained at the Collège de France, or taught at the Collège de France, I believe, and they both came out of the French tradition, and they both came out of the French philosophical tradition. They were, at root, philosophers.
Right.
Baudrillard is different because Baudrillard was a sociologist.
I see.
And that gives him a very different view of the world. So he's not starting with a series of philosophical axioms and then working his way toward answers. He's doing a sociological analysis, and then he's deriving his ideas from what he sees in the world, what he sees going on socially in the world. And so that means he's very interesting. He takes a slightly different tack than the other guys. And he gets a little bit strange in places. He has some weird ideas. For example, he wrote a book called "The Gulf War Did Not Take Place."
Oh, I didn't see that one. Okay.
So you kind of think, well, what do you mean the Gulf War didn't take place? What are you talking about? And from his certain little perspective, it is going to make sense. But because of the terminology he uses, and because of the way he's operating, and because he's writing this book, I mean, Simulacra and Simulations came out, I believe, I want to say 1981. And so his observations are observations he's making through the 70s about media and technology and all the rest of it. And what that turns out to mean is that he's really reaching for something that nobody else has really thought of yet. I mean, he's taking some of Marshall McLuhan's work, and he's influenced by Guy Debord, who we'll talk about a little bit more. But Baudrillard is really going to take things beyond what they believed, and so he's really going to get into some new ideas. First, we're going to pull on a couple of my favorite philosophers. This is Joseph Heath and Andrew Potter's The Rebel Cell: Why the Culture Can't Be Jammed. And this book was, I believe, came out in 2004. Yeah, it came out in 2004. And in 2004, the thing that was popular at the time, I don't know if I don't know how familiar your audience will be with this, but there was a lot of what we might call culture jamming or counterculture stuff that was going on. A lot of, so if you think of Adbusters magazine is a good example of this.
Yeah, I remember them from when I went to art school.
Yeah,
Adbusters. Mm-hmm.
yeah. All of that stuff, that kind of countercultural zeitgeist, where the idea was we were going to rebel against society because society is a prison and we need to rebel against it or whatever. That's what this book is about. It's about culture jamming and why that doesn't work. Why all of that awareness raising activism was a little bit silly in their view or counterproductive. That the real work of politics has to do with other things. But in the 20 years or so since this book was written, the counterculture movement has given way to the woke movement. I think you'll remember back, I mean, in the 60s, 70s, we had like the hippies, and then the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, we have the countercultural people. So you think of Naomi Klein's No Logo. You think of the entire sort of countercultural movement of people wearing Che Guevara t-shirts and white guys with dreads and, you know, talking about how we need to fight the system, man, and the man just wants to keep you down. And the pot guys are like, the fuzz is spending the man round to bust your stash, man, because you got to free your mind. You know, that whole kind of thing. All of that has actual intellectual underpinnings in books like the Greening of America.
Who is that?
Robert Reich. You know, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. All of those kinds of literature. The work of Thorsten Veblen is kind of in there somewhere, and he's tracing all of that. And so, but that is the precursor to wokeness. So we're going to read a little bit of this, and because they're going to talk about a guy named Guy Debord, who kind of sets the stage for a lot of Baudrillard's thinking. Then we'll talk about Baudrillard, and hopefully somewhere in there we'll be able to talk about how the hippie movement, how the same movement which led rise to the hippies kept going, and that movement transmogrified and moved around and grew and evolved and eventually kind of leads into wokeness.
Okay. Sounds
all right.
good.
So now that we have our introduction. Okay. So they'll start off with the movie The Matrix. And what he says the Matrix is the idea that we're all kind of stuck in the system, right? We're all plugged into the system of social control because the Matrix is an allegory, right? We want to get out of the Matrix. We want to get out of the system of social control that's keeping us down. And he says, that's an idea that found its highest expression in the work of Guy Debord, unofficial leader of the Situationist Internationale, and his later disciple Jean Baudrillard. Debord was a radical Marxist, an author of Society of the Spectacle, and one of the prime movers behind the 1968 Paris Uprising. His thesis was simple. The world we live in is not real. Consumer capitalism has taken every authentic human experience, transformed it into a commodity, and then sold it back to us through mass media and advertising. Thus, every part of human life has been drawn into, quote-unquote, the spectacle, which is nothing but a system of symbols and representations governed by its own internal logic. The spectacle is capital to such a degree of accumulation that it becomes an image, Debord wrote. Thus we live in a world of total ideology in which we are completely alienated from our essential nature. So basically he thinks capitalism has invaded every area of society and destroyed all the authenticity. Everything is fake. Your relationship is fake because the ring that you got from your wedding was just something that was picked because somebody wrote an advertisement about it in a magazine, and your vacation was fake because the only reason you went on vacation to Mexico is because you saw it in an advertisement. All your food is fake, and the only reason you want to eat it is because you see a bunch of commercials. Your job is fake because, and so on and so forth. Debord is saying that everything has been commodified and sold back to you, and what he thinks is, Debord thinks that the purpose of these commodities is something like the accumulation of power and status. And what he thinks is that we're buying commodities and we're buying things no longer for what their use is, but we're buying them because of what they say about us, the identity they help us build, because we want to show off to other people, because we want to look good, because it provides us status, etc., etc. So the underlying actual use of commodities and objects and things is, for Debord, completely removed. So Debord would say, I bought this guitar because I like to play guitar. And it's useful and it's good. And the reason I like it is because I saw it in a Lenny Kravitz video when I was 15, and so on. Debord would say that the purpose of this instrument is what it symbolizes and the status that it gives me. That its value is in its commodity structure in some way, but that commodity structure is the commodity is the status, the influence, and the symbolism of it.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Baudrillard is going to take that idea and he's going to run with it, man. He's going to take that idea and say, he's going to say, Debord, you're just getting started. You're just at the tip of the iceberg. So, for Debord and the Situationists, the veil of illusion could be pierced much more easily. So, you're surrounded by all this and bombarded by mass media and advertisements, right? And it's coming at you from all directions and you can't see outside of it. And so that's socializing you. It's setting the path. It's normalizing certain ideas for you and making them seem natural, because it's just, you look around, it's just everywhere. You're soaked in it, right?
Well, when I was probably in 1987, I stopped reading any newspapers. I think I stopped watching TV in about 1980. And yeah, and I don't know exactly what it was. It wasn't that I was reading philosophy, but it seemed to me like there was a lot of information out there that wasn't important, and that was clouding my perceptions of what I wanted to focus on. It was distracting. I found it distracting. I think that's what it was.
And that is, so there is, in a lot of these guys, there's a nugget of truth. And I think that there is a nugget of truth in some of what Debord is saying, that, yeah, we can sometimes go too far in trying to purchase social status that we haven't earned.
Right.
Or that we're trying to be something, we're trying to create an image for ourselves more than we're trying to create a substance. And so,
well, marketing, the whole industry of marketing and advertising, when did that blow up? When did that become big? And I imagine when the internet became available, then that really would have boomed, because then you could just market everywhere. And that would have an impact on society, and it would have an impact on individual choices. So it's no wonder maybe that this was, a red flag.
Yeah. And so he picks up on that, and he eventually comes to the conclusion that all social relations are mediated by images created and sold to us by mass media. A collective brainwashing that has overtaken everything from Christmas. So you create the perfect Christmas moment like on TV, to dating. You want to create the perfect date just like in the movies, et cetera, et cetera.
When I was a kid, we had Sundays off. There was nothing open on Sundays.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It was a day of rest. And then it no longer was a day of rest eventually. And that would go along with the idea of consumerism.
Yeah. And there is something
have changed in that direction. You can see little by little, society did move in that direction.
And there is something to be said for Debord's and for Baudrillard and some of these other guys, their observations about consumerism and how we can get overly caught up in the accumulation of wealth and status. That certainly is a problem. And Debord, I think that's part of what animates him. Is exactly those observations. The problem is what they do with it and where they go with it.
That's often the problem in postmodernism. There's a good idea, but the direction that they go to solve it is questionable.
Yeah, they'll make some observation about the world which is correct, and then they'll run with that to the point where it runs off the rails.
Yeah, right.
So Debord thinks, look, you're bombarded by all the mass media, and it's setting up like a system of social control. All of your ideas and thoughts and your dreams are being are constructed with images that have been sold to you from mass media. He's writing this, by the way, when the main drivers of media are newspaper, television, and radio. You'd have to wonder what he'd think of now.
Yeah,
yeah. When it's on your watch, it's on your phone. So here's what he says. For Debord and the Situationists, the veil of illusion could be pierced much more easily, right? Because the idea that the world we live in is a veil of illusion is not new. Plato had the analogy of the cave. Lots of people have thought that there's a world behind the real world that we have to kind of see through the mirage. That's an old idea. For Debord and the Situationists, the veil of illusion could be pierced easily. All that it takes is some slight cognitive dissonance, a sign that something's not right in the world around us. This could be provoked by a work of art, an act of protest, an article of clothing. In Debord's view, quote, disturbances with the lowliest and most ephemeral of origins have eventually disrupted the order of the world. And this is the origin of the idea of culture jamming. Traditional political activism is useless. It's like trying to perform political institutions inside the matrix. What's the point? What we really need to do is wake people up, unplug them, free them from the grip of the spectacle, and the way to do that is by producing cognitive dissonance through symbolic act of resistance to suggest something that's not right with the world. And that's why you see that was a lot of the old school activism, the graffiti, the wearing of the weird clothes, the holding of protests. All of it was
and now graffiti is everywhere. We've traveled through Europe broadly just the last couple of months, and a lot of the cities are very decorated. They're defaced by graffiti. The tagging. We went to, I think it was Albania, that we were in the capital of Albania, and they hired 50 people to go and clean up all the graffiti. And then they found they decided what the best artists were, which were the best artists, and they hired them.
Okay.
They hired them, and now they only have one person who has to clean up because there's no graffiti anymore, because the people have a place to draw and paint and make works of art, really, instead of this kind of at night and behind the scenes and this radical kind of thing. It's not like that anymore there. We're hoping that we can take those ideas and spread them, because really, it's hard. You walk down the street and it's the beauty of the buildings is masked by the graffiti. It does change your experience of the city. It really does.
Yeah. And a lot of that sort of has its roots in precisely this, the idea that I'm gonna put something on the sign of a building. I'm gonna say, like, capitalism kills or something like that. I'm gonna just write that on the side of the building, and that's gonna be like a message that breaks through the iron grip of mass media on everyone's consciousness. I'm gonna put out a webzine. I'm gonna Adbusters they talk about this in the book, The Black Spot Sneaker, where they sold you a sneaker and it's got a black spot on the side, and it was an Adbusters sneaker, and it was, if you buy the sneaker, people will ask you what the black spot means, or it's not a brand, it's not Nike, it's not Reebok, it's not any of those brands. It's gonna serve as some sort of like a nudge that, hey, you don't need to be involved in mass media. There's a world outside of mass media. Your brain has been, filled with all the images from mass media, but we can get out of it. We can break out of that matrix. And Potter and Heath make the observation that, they sold Adbusters magazine. They had the Adbusters sneaker. These people sell Che Guevara t-shirts and books and books and books. And he says, man, capitalism is very efficient at providing lots of anti-capitalist literature.
Yeah. It says it's like nihilists going and to a mosh pit and dancing all night long to something that they love. It doesn't matter. You can't get away from the meaning in life. You can try.
That's right.
Always comes back.
It's
It
almost
always
as though
comes
they're running
back.
from it.
Yeah.
Yeah. They, and the postmodernists do this with
Interesting.
language. They say language can be interpreted any way you want it to be, and then you say, well, you said this, and they say, oh, you misunderstood me. Well, hold on a second.
Yeah.
I'd like to call a timeout, please. So, yeah. So that's Debord.
Mm-hmm.
Baudrillard's going to take that view, and he is going to run with that.
Okay. Let's talk about
Baudrillard
that.
is going to go and run. So where Debord thought that the spectacle was an affirmation of appearances and an identification of all of human social life with appearances, he thought the appearances were trying to mimic some kind of reality. That there was a reality, and that capitalism was selling you the appearance rather than the reality.
Mm-hmm. So they felt like they were. It sounds like they felt like they were being separate. They were being separated from their real selves, and in a way, they were. Because I would say, it sounds to me like because they had left their faith, they were feeling separate, but they didn't see it as an ethical. Not really. They didn't see it as an ethical problem. They saw it as a consumer problem.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's. I think they saw it as a problem of consumerism. Mm-hmm. That we are alienated from our true selves, and it's not strictly speaking a Marxist version, although that's kind of maybe lurking in the background somewhere. But it's all about appearances now, not reality. Everyone's trying to appear some way to somebody else, and that's the spectacle. That's what Debord calls the spectacle. We're all performing for other people.
Yeah.
Baudrillard's going to take that a step further. So here's what Baudrillard's going to do. So Baudrillard's going to argue that as our lives become ever more saturated with signs, symbols, communications, messaging, advertising, and technology, we're going to be captivated and dazzled and in some ways seduced by the systems of signs and symbols and technology to the point reality is going to disappear. It's no longer going to be that we want the appearance of reality. It's that the signs and the symbols and the language are going to become the reality that actually matters. As we get through ever faster cycles of communication, trade, production, education, as we get through ever more amounts of media and deeper saturation of media and deeper layers of discourse, we're going to hit escape velocity from reality. And what is real and what is not real is going to become in some ways indecipherable to us, and we're going to lose touch with the world. Okay?
Yep.
So people think, well, what do you mean? You mean like you're not going to see like physical objects? Like I'm not going to be able to say, I don't know, this phone. Like you're not going to know that phone? Of course that's real. What are you talking about, Baudrillard? What are you? So I'm going to use an analogy. And this is the analogy of the strawberry Slurpee. And we're going to try and get a hold of what Baudrillard's on about. Because what Baudrillard's going to get to is the idea that the reality for us is what happens in the signs, symbols, the discourse, the discussion, the media, the images. That is what matters. And the underlying material reality is secondary. That's what he calls the desert of the real. Because that's not nearly as stimulating as the artificial world.
Wow. Disembodied. That's very disembodied.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's going to say that all the action and in terms of our motivations, goals, desires, all of our political projects, all of the social action is occurring in the signs, symbols, and language, in the discursive games, in the media, in the technology, all in there. And the say, walking through the forest is going to be, picking up the flowers is boring by comparison. Reality is boring. Hyperreality is exciting. So, in order to get what we're talking about, we're going to talk about the strawberry Slurpee. Okay? So, this is the analogy. So, you and I are in ancient Rome, and we're walking through ancient Rome, or some ancient city in the 1st century. And as we're walking, you and I see you and me and Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pajot are all walking through the city. And we see some berries off by the side of the road. And they're kind of red, and they got a little bit of green on them. And we go over, we pick them up, and we eat them and say, hey, these aren't bad. Those are strawberries. Those strawberries are real. Okay. So fast forward to 1960, and you, me, and Jordan, and Jonathan Peugeot are all still alive because the Lord has blessed us with long life. And we learn about selective breeding. And we realize, hey, if we only plant the seeds that come to us from the reddest, juiciest strawberries, what we'll end up doing is we'll end up creating a new strain of strawberry that's bigger and redder and juicier and sweeter. So we do that.
Right.
And what we end up with is these selectively grown, big, red, juicy strawberries. Let's call those a productive copy. Okay? So now we've got the big, red, juicy strawberries. Then someone figures out that, hey, we can, if we breed these strawberries in the correct way, we can maximize for only the characteristics we want. We can actually pick. So we do that. And then we get perfect strawberries. And we now have perfect strawberry seeds, and we're planting perfect strawberries.
Yeah.
But then someone comes along and says, we can take those strawberries and we can turn those strawberries into jam. So now we have strawberry jam.
Mm-hmm.
And someone else comes along and says, hey, Paul Vanderklay comes along and says, hey, we can take the strawberry jam and we can mix it up and we can make it into strawberry pie filling. Wow. And then Benjamin Boyce comes along and he says, we can take the strawberry pie filling and I can turn that into a strawberry candy. And then James Lindsay comes along and he says, I can take that candy and I can add some natural sugar to it to make it sweeter. And then Peter Boghossian comes along and he says, we don't even need to use real sugar. We can use high fructose corn syrup. And then, yeah, and this is happening forever all the time. Then Colin Wright comes along and he says, we don't even need to use real strawberry. We can just extract that strawberry flavor out of the strawberries and use the high fructose corn syrup and make a Jolly Rancher. And then someone says, we don't even need to extract the real strawberry flavor. We can create a synthetic strawberry flavor and use high fructose corn syrup. And then Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro come along and say, hey, you know what? Forget all that. We'll take the high fructose corn syrup and the artificial strawberry flavoring, and we're going to make a strawberry flavored soda. And finally, Jeremy Boring comes along and says, don't give your money to people that hate you. Give your money to me. And says, I'm going to make a strawberry Slurpee that tastes like the strawberry soda, which tastes like the artificial candy, which tastes like the candy with the real flavor, which tastes like the candy with the real flavor with the real sugar, which tastes like the candy, which tastes like the organic candy, which tastes like the pie filling, which tastes like the jam, which tastes like the genetically modified strawberry, which tastes like the selectively grown strawberry, which tastes like the original strawberry. And all of a sudden, we went from that real strawberry to a strawberry Slurpee. And the strawberry Slurpee contains none of the ingredients of the original strawberry. And now my son, when my son sits around and my son thinks of what a strawberry tastes like, what does he think of? The paradigm of strawberry for him is the Slurpee.
Yeah.
So I give him a strawberry Slurpee, and when he's done, he drinks or eats the regular strawberry and says, well, these kind of look like the picture on the box or the picture on the Slurpee machine over strawberry Slurpee, but they don't taste the same. And I much prefer the strawberry Slurpee.
Mm-hmm.
This is what John Baudrillard is talking about.
Right. Becoming separate from reality.
Yeah. It's
through
the copies.
marketing.
It's the copies of the copies of the copies of the copies of the copies that eventually give rise to a thing that is disconnected. That the only relation between the strawberry Slurpee and that organic strawberry is the name.
Right.
That strawberry Slurpee doesn't taste like an organic strawberry.
Right.
And so
same problem as with pornography. Same problem.
Oh, I was about to use that as an example. I actually have used that as an example before. The same thing happens. We could do the same thing with women. Back in ancient Rome, we have real women, and they're just walking around. Then someone says, well, we can invent makeup. Okay, so now you have women and you have makeup. And then someone says, well, we can invent hair products. Now you have women with makeup and hair products. And then someone invents the push-up bra. So now you have a woman with makeup, hair products, and a push-up bra. And then someone else invents breast implants. Now you have wake up, hair products, a push-up bra, and breast implants. And then someone says, well, we can take pictures. So now you have a picture of a woman with makeup, hair, and breast implants and a push-up bra. And then someone says, we can adjust the lighting to make her even prettier. So now you have perfect lighting of a picture of a woman wearing a push-up bra and with breast implants, makeup and hair. And then someone else says, hey, you know what we can do? We can airbrush. And then someone else comes along and says, hey, you know what? We can do filtering. And then someone says, we can alter the proportions. And then you get a picture on Instagram of a woman that nobody looks like. She doesn't even look like herself. Nobody can look like that because nobody's walking around with a filter. And so you end up with a situation where you have people are watching images on a screen of women that nobody looks like.
Mm-hmm.
It's beyond what's real. It's hyper real. We've gone past what's possible in reality. And that's what Baudrillard's looking at. He thinks that the hyper real stimulus that we have through our technology and through our discourse, we've advanced away from real. We start off with these early things that are real, and then we have copies of the real, and then we have representations of copies of the real. And as we go, eventually we get it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And then eventually you get a thing that's not a copy of anything. It's a simulation of nothing. And Baudrillard calls these pure simulacra. He says it's a simulation with no origin point. And that's the strawberry Slurpee.
No origin point. What does it mean, no origin point? Because isn't the origin point the strawberry?
Well, Baudrillard's going to say it's got an escape velocity from the strawberry because it doesn't taste like the strawberry anymore.
Yeah, right.
It's so that idea of strawberry flavoring doesn't taste like the strawberry. And so Baudrillard says
it's different.
When he says there's no origin point, what he means is that it's not referencing anything in the real world that's actually like that. And the flavor strawberry, in reference to the strawberry Slurpee, that flavor doesn't actually refer to anything that a real strawberry would taste like.
Yeah.
And so he thinks what you end up with is that you end up with images which represent that which does not exist in reality, which can't exist in reality. So in our example of our Instagram model who's got all the makeup and all her hair done and the push-up bra and the breast implant and the perfect lighting and then the Photoshop and the filter and everything else, there's nothing in reality that looks like that. That isn't a real thing.
No, it's a Muppet, actually. Have you seen some of those images where women, the Muppets with the big long eyelashes and the big lips, and now that's what women look like?
Yeah. And Baudrillard is saying you're getting escape velocity from the real world. You could do a lot of analysis with this all over the place.
Right.
Baudrillard said that the Gulf War didn't happen, and what he meant by that is not that there wasn't actually something happening in Iraq. What he said was the understanding, when Americans think of the Iraq War, they're thinking of the media, they're thinking of the images that they have been shown through media.
Right.
And that's the only idea they have. And Baudrillard says, that's not what the war actually looks like. And he says the soldiers that are flying the drones and dropping the bombs, all they have is what's on their screen. Rick Roderick called them Nintendo pilots because he said you might as well be playing a video game.
Right.
So there's the on-the-ground experience of what that's actually like is being experienced by nobody in the United States. Maybe some of the
Mm-hmm.
soldiers are, the victims of the war are, and the people who are killed are, but we don't know anything about that.
Mm-hmm.
So he
Yeah.
says the Gulf War, when the media says the Gulf War, they're talking about the Gulf War as told to us by the images that are coming through various screens, by the newspaper headlines. He goes, that never happened.
Yeah. It's like the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games, they do stories. They do interest stories on the athletes.
Mm-hmm.
They do so much of that you hardly ever see the sports anymore, because it's all about the stories of the behind the scenes stories instead of the sports themselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the problem with that? That sounds right to me.
Well,
So far.
so Baudrillard has made an observation, and Baudrillard's observation is that you've got these things which aren't connected to reality. But Baudrillard's going to push this and say, we can't get a hold of reality.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks that what's real and what's a simulacra are indistinguishable.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't know the real from the non-real. You couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah,
You don't
I can
know
see
what's
that
authentic
happening to
and what's
some
not.
people's perceptions. I can see that being a problem, but it doesn't have to be that way, right?
Well, this is kind of the problem for Baudrillard, because Baudrillard doesn't think there's a way out.
He doesn't. And why would he not think there was a way out? He was a smart guy.
Well, this is I think Baudrillard thinks that hyperreality just is the case now, and that it's indecipherable. And because he thinks that you couldn't go back to the real, the reason he thinks you couldn't get back to the real from the hyperreal is because he says, how are you going to tell the difference? If I walk up to somebody in the middle of nowhere and I put an organic strawberry and a regular strawberry in front of them and say, which one of those is the simulacra and which one of those is real, the average person's not going to be able to know.
Right. Or the one that's GMO changed. Yeah. No, it's true. It's true. But these things have been happening forever. Corn wasn't a corn stalk wasn't this big yellow, corn. It's been changed to be what it is today. This didn't just happen since advertising and marketing began. This happened. This has been happening for millennia, these kind of changes. But they know that history, these men. They don't take that into consideration?
No, it's not that they don't. And this is the key. For Baudrillard, it's not just that things are changing. What Baudrillard thinks is that all of our thinking and all of what we're dealing with and all of that, what matters to us, what we're motivated by, because we're social creatures, exists in the social realm of signs and symbols and language. And that we only care about the corn insofar as it symbolizes something or as a symbol, and we only understand it as a symbol or a sign or a representation of some sort. And so what he thinks is that because that's the only realm in which anything that matters is happening in society, that is where all the action is going to take place. The desert of the real is something that people will abandon for the hyperreal. No one's going to go through the forest and pick up a flower when you can put on your VR headset and get even more beautiful fake flowers and a smell so sweet that doesn't exist in reality while you have your strawberry Slurpee. Why would you smell a real flower in the forest eating an organic strawberry when you can sit at home and have a 3D rendered forest that has flowers that are more beautiful than real flowers and drink a Slurpee that tastes better than a real strawberry? The hyper-reality just invades and takes over, and the hyper-reality becomes the meta for all that exists. Baudrillard thinks we're already in that realm. He thought we were in that realm in 1981. I can only imagine what he'd think today, looking around now at the world.
Yes.
Right? You can see where he's coming from, but he thinks that we can't get it. So his idea is that things like truth are going to disappear.
Right.
Because correspondence to reality, because he thinks that reality is being washed away. That
it is in some way. It is in some way. For sure.
And he thinks we have to have a new politics in order to deal with this. Now, I don't want to get too much into his politics, but he says I want to make just a quick. We should be careful to note Baudrillard's not claiming simulations are performances. What he thinks is that the simulations create the effect of the real thing and present as the real event with all the effects that come with it. But they're inauthentic spectacles that merely symbolize the elements of the real thing. So Baudrillard says that in a simulation, you're substituting the signs of the real for the real. So the symbol gets substituted for the real thing. The strawberry Slurpee, which is supposed to taste like a strawberry, replaces the idea of strawberry in my son's head. So now when my son thinks strawberry, he thinks the flavor of the Slurpee and not the actual organic strawberry. The symbols and the signs and the representation replace the real as the thing that we actually care about, as the thing that we're looking at, as the object up for consideration.
That has happened largely. I mean, people, they drink diet sodas and there aren't any. There you go. That's not good for you. Stop that. People don't have dining room tables in their houses in Britain anymore, so they don't sit down together for a meal. You know, it really has added, well, I don't know, exactly what has torn the family apart, but convenience, the convenience of going to the corner store to get what you need means that you don't have to use your own ingenuity to figure out how to create something.
Yeah. So
to get by, you can for fun, but to get by, you just go to the store.
Oh yeah. You don't need to make anything. I don't need to cook. I could get my whole life without cooking. I could.
My mother sewed all my clothing when I was young. Right?
Absolutely.
And we didn't buy any. We didn't have any bought cookies in our house, or she made the cookies from scratch. Everything was made from scratch. The bread was made from scratch. Everything was made in the kitchen when I was a kid, and now you don't have to do any of that. You can actually just order Uber Eats. You don't even need to have a kitchen, because you can just order Uber Eats as long as you have a garbage can.
You're good. That's a perfect example. The sewing thing was just perfect, because there's a point to be made here about Baudrillard might say something like this, that you used to wear boots because you needed to wear boots. You needed steel toes to protect you. They were made for a reality. Now you wear them as a fashion statement. It's what they represent. And the thing that they represent is why you buy them. That's what actually matters. So the economy, the exchange of money for goods and services, is not happening on the basis of need or utility or use. It's on the basis of the sign value. That is, the value of the object as a symbol in the system of symbols. Right?
Yeah.
So you don't buy this. Baudrillard's going to say you don't buy this for its usefulness. You buy that because of what it looks like and the symbolism of it.
Well, that is part of it.
But Baudrillard's going to say that's the whole show.
Yeah, that's the whole show.
The representation is all that matters. My ideas about music aren't related to the inherent sounds or the music. They're related to my image of a rock star in my head, the image I'm trying to project.
Yeah.
And that's a step further than Debord, because Debord still sees these things all as commodities being influenced by images and appearances. And Baudrillard's saying the commodity itself is not the point at all. It's not a commodity anymore. It's been completely replaced by the meta of sign value and symbols and representation. So I want to just read something here real quick so that I can.
Okay. And then I want to bring up something, because I read the article that you sent me on Baudrillard.
Yes.
Yeah. There's some things in there. So tell me what it is that you're.
Baudrillard claims with the new era of simulation, we move to a whole new era of social development. For Baudrillard, we leave the society of the commodity and its stable supports we transcend the society of the spectacle and its dissembling masks, and we bid farewell to modernity in its dream of production, and we enter the postmodern society of simulacrum, an abstract non-society devoid of cohesive relations, shared meaning, and political struggle. I hope that's all clear. I want to make sure that, because I mean, Baudrillard is in some senses very how do we say it, weird, and it's hard to get our head around, but I think it's important because it can look like he's a lot like Debord, and he is, but it's important to emphasize that for Baudrillard, we've got an escape velocity from the material world in terms of what we're thinking, our motivations, our politics, how we conceive of truth, how we think about the world. And we're now concerned entirely with signs, symbols, and representations. We care about strawberry Slurpees, not strawberries.
Right. And what did he do? What did he do with truth, though, in order to undermine truth?
Well, if everything is inauthentic, well, okay, we'll talk about that in a second. Can we get to the thing that you wanted to read? Because we'll get to the truth question in a second when we talk about implosion.
So there's this book called The Transparency of Evil. I don't know what year that was written. Anyway, he talks about a situation in which previously separate domains of economy, art, politics, and sexuality collapsed into each other. He claims that art, for instance, has penetrated all spheres of existence, whereby the dreams of artistic avant-garde for art to inform life has been realized. Yet in his vision, with the realization of art in everyday life, art itself as separate and transcendent phenomena has disappeared. So he's saying also there then that art is only for consumption. It's to decorate a wall, but can't have any more meaning than decorating a wall.
Oh, yeah.
So right. And so people would buy a piece of art because it's the right color for their wall, but the meaning of the image would have nothing more of significance than that.
Yeah, it's all flattened. The art doesn't exist for some higher purpose to point us towards some higher good. The art was selected because it matches the drapes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So then he says that, and then Baudrillard calls this situation trans aesthetics. He called it trans aesthetics, which he relates to similar phenomena of trans politics, transsexuality, and trans economics, in which everything becomes political, sexual, and economic, so that these domains, like art, lose their specificity, their boundaries, and their distinctness. So is this, because now we're in this time of transsexuality, and what that used to mean, it doesn't mean that anymore. Now it means actual changing of genders.
Mm-hmm.
And I've thought of this as the end result, this trans phenomena, as the end result of the partly of feminism and the undermining of sexuality, the undermining of mothers having children, the undermining of men being useful in society and doing meaningful work. And so people have lost their grip on meaning and the necessity for being true to themselves. But you're saying that Baudrillard had something to do with this, that this came from the whole postmodern. So postmodernism and feminism have both kind of come together now at this point in the body.
Yeah. So
the end result.
I would say this about that. So first off, Baudrillard does not like this postmodernism. In fact, he's despondent about it. He thinks he's describing reality. It's not like Foucault and Derrida, where they were advancing postmodern doctrines and saying, we really like this stuff. We want to do it like this.
Mm-hmm.
Baudrillard is more like, look at the work, like, oh, damn it. Like he's upset about it. It's like, oh no. Oh no, this is bad. Guys, no, we don't like this. But he's also, Baudrillard is like kind of, he comes across pessimistically cynical at times as well.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that you're talking about, or that the trans aesthetic is pointing at, I don't think that they're meaning trans is the same way as transgender, although maybe in that context, I haven't read the book, I don't know. But what the Baudrillardian piece of that is that Baudrillard talks about implosion. For Baudrillard, modern societies and classical societies were characterized by differentiation. So I'm reading here from the SEP. This is Douglas Kellner. For Baudrillard, postmodern societies are characterized by de-differentiation, the collapse of the power of distinctions, or implosion. In his society of simulation, the realms of economics, politics, culture, sexuality, and the social all implode into each other. In this implosive mix, economics is fundamentally shaped by culture, politics, and other spheres, while art, once a sphere of potential difference and opposition, is absorbed into the economic and political. Sexuality is everywhere. In this situation, differences between individual groups implode in a rapidly mutating or changing dissolution of the social and the previous boundaries and structures upon which social theory had once focused. So all of the distinctions upon which society had been structured all start to collapse, because everything becomes merely signs and symbols, and those signs and symbols can be grown and changed and distorted to the point where you could have a male bodybuilder and a female bodybuilder that look more similar to each other than to men or to women. Or you could have a situation where a man wears makeup and a dress in such a way that he looks like exactly like a woman, and that distinction is lost. Technology can allow us to surgically alter the body in order to create the appearance of a male or a female. And so all of those distinctions, the power of those distinctions, the ontological anchors in reality we've been cut from. And because it's only about the symbolic representation, those lines get blurred. And so Baudrillard thinks that all of the distinctions start to implode and start to break and start to crack and start to lose all of their power, and society can no longer be structured according to them. So you can see that with the trans thing most clearly. We've lost our distinctions between male and female, and so now we're losing our distinction between men's and women's sports, and now we're losing our distinction between how men and women ought to behave. And so now we're losing our distinctions upon which family was built. And so that destroys all the dating and relationship mores. And what shows up in its place is people say, do whatever you want. But then the question is, why would I want to do anything? Because I'm a man? No. Because she's a woman? No. I can't put any expectations on somebody else, because if I put expectations on somebody else, that's a problem, because that's oppressive. So I don't know what to expect from someone else.
And now if the state pays for your rent and pays for your food, then you don't have to do anything.
And so you end up in a situation where all of those structures have imploded on themselves. There's nothing holding them up except for the sheer inertia of people going to work every day for a paycheck. But there's nothing underneath of them.
So if you think that everything that you do is consumption, then that would be the end result. And that has been the end result in people who haven't got a moral compass to find that the meaning comes from service to yourself and to one another, and gratitude. So, right. So they've lost these moral compasses. So it's going to go somewhere. It's going to devolve. It has devolved. Yeah.
And it's crumbling. Wicked.
And it's crumbling. Yeah.
And Baudrillard's pointing out this crumbling, and he says, well, we need a new politics for a post-truth world.
So is Baudrillard still alive?
No, he died, I believe, in 2007.
And what kind of did he swear to any kind of ethical understanding when he was old? Did he have any faith when he was old?
I don't know. Baudrillard is a tough nut to crack in terms of what his morals would be, because part of Baudrillard's problem is that he thinks that we do need a new kind of politics for a post-truth world. But I haven't read anything from him where he sketches out what exactly that would look like.
Right.
he's not being purely negative. It's more that he's trying to state what's happening. That's why he's a sociologist, so he's much more descriptive than he is proscriptive. He called 9/11. He said 9/11 was important because that was the first time an event had occurred in a very long time. He basically thought that since at least the falling of the Soviet Union, events didn't really happen. Things were just going along, but it was just things going along because things go along. 9/11 was a rupturing event, something that really mattered, that it was important. That was, oh, wait, we're not at the end of history. It was a big, important thing. But he's at the end of his life by the time that happens, and he doesn't really put forth what he thinks a post-truth politics could look like or what to do. And I think that he's a little too cynical, a little too nihilistic, because he seems to just accept that hyperreality and simulation and implosion are just here to stay.
Yeah.
I don't think that's correct.
I don't either.
And this is where I would break with Baudrillard. I think Baudrillard is somewhat useful in terms of pointing things out, but I don't think he's very terrific in terms of his solutions of what do we do now.
Yeah, that's okay though. I mean, it couldn't have been an easy road to go down to identify all of that and not see through it and not see a way towards a better place.
Yeah. I mean,
that sounds rough.
Yeah. I mean, eventually, he left the university system in 87 and then basically engaged in a sort of, Kellner calls it, says he dedicated himself to caustic reflections on our contemporary moment and philosophical ruminations that cultivate his distinct and always evolving theory. He also distanced himself from the other iterations of postmodern theory. So he actually wrote a book called Forget Foucault, which I don't want to get too much into at the moment, but he was critical of Foucault. He was critical of Derrida.
So maybe he did have some insight in the end of a way away from these things.
Yeah. And so, how do I say this? It's hard because in his political idea and his political theories and his political ideology, sex, politics, and economic all lose their distinctions. They lose their specificity. And the result is that things like judgment, things like standards are wiped away. There's no transcendent standards for anything. There's no.
Well, he's right about that. The universities have given up the SATs and all of the MCATs and all of the standardized testing. So young people who are going to university aren't held to any standard anymore. The entrance exams, all of that has been undermined by group choice.
And so because these domains, the sexual, economic, and the political domains collapse, all of their boundaries and their distinctiveness is completely lost. And so all of the normative, all of the norms, standards, boundaries all collapse in sort of this morass of indifference and inertia, as Kellner puts it. In postmodernism, he thinks that everything becomes an image, a sign, and a spectacle. Everything becomes a part of every domain and has influences on every domain, and nothing is just purely to its own domain. All politics is about sex. All sex is about politics. Every sexual object is also a political object, is also an economic object. Every economic object is also, in turn, a sexual object, because sex is about status and objects are about status. And so all the differentiation is lost. Everything just gets kind of bled together. And you can see this really clearly right now in our politics, where all of our politics is part of entertainment and all of our entertainment is part of politics. All of it. So all the culture creators are expected to weigh in on political things, and all the political people are expected to tell us what their favorite books, television shows, and movies are. The whole thing has imploded and sucked in on itself. Everything has.
Even the idea of natural resources. You know that water is a natural resource.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we need purification, we need water treatment plants. So we need people working on those things and discovering ways to make the water clean. That's not natural. That's not a natural resource. Oil and gas are natural resources, but we need to pump it. We need to put it in pipes. So thinking of them, we have this idea that they're a natural resource, so we need to make sure we leave them alone. But the whole idea of natural resource might be a postmodern term. It might actually be a postmodern term because it's not natural. The only thing that's natural is air. Air is natural.
I don't know.
That'd be about the only.
Or water from a brook.
Water from a brook, possibly here and there, but scarcely.
Because we filter all of our water, right? All of our food is cooked. And so Baudrillard, that would be perfect, because Baudrillard's going to say, when we talk about natural resources, well, raw materials from the earth, but as soon as you pull it out and start using it, you're no longer just using it as a raw material. It's what it can be used for. And Baudrillard's going to say,
it is.
The old natural resources were natural because they came from nature, and they were resources because of what they could be used for. Baudrillard is going to say, now things are resources based on their symbolic value, what they represent,
right.
The status they confer. Their use is almost besides the point. In fact, it is besides the point.
So that would go into environmentalist ideas of why, how we're raping the earth, and that Mother Nature, and we're raping the earth, and we're right. So we're
because they care about what it represents.
They care about what it represents, not about its utility
or how it affects people's lives,
or its economics. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's
it's very interesting.
Yeah, because they're caught up in. If we wanted to do a Baudrillardian analysis, we could say that the environmental movement isn't about what actually protects other species or plants or animals. It's, and a Baudrillardian analysis would say that the environmentalist movement is about creating identity for the people involved. It's about the status that it gives them. It's about how they're viewed. It's about,
sure it is.
And he would say that none of this has anything to do with what actually saves the earth or what actually saves the world.
This is climate change. Same thing.
It's what it represents symbolically. So all of their activism. So, for example, anti-nuclear activism isn't based on what's best for us given our energy needs. Anti-nuclear activism is, what does nuclear represent, and what kind of counter culture do we want to represent? Because a lot of the people who are on the hard left are against hierarchies of any kind and against structure of any kind. So a kind of postmodern implosion, as Baudrillard would have it, where all the distinctions and the structures are collapsed in on each other, is something they love. Yeah. They want that. They want the flattening of hierarchies.
That's the way it is. Or they think that is the way it is. I'm sure they believe it.
Yeah, they think that the hierarchies are unjust and ought to be collapsed. In fact, it would be better for them to be collapsed on that kind of postmodern leftist view, right? The hierarchies are all constructed anyway. They're not natural. They have no reason to exist, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
So Baudrillard is describing something. And he gets very strange sometimes. It's hard to figure out what he means about anything. With respect to your art point, something that is important to note is that Baudrillard thinks, you're right, art is everywhere, but there aren't any fundamental standards, criterion, rules that would differentiate an artistic object for another object. And there's also no standards, rules, or criteria that would provide a basis for anything like judgment or taste or enjoyment or anything else.
Mm-hmm.
There's no criteria of better and worse. That's all gone.
Right.
Because those terms, better and worse, that dichotomy has been collapsed too. Good and evil, that's going to collapse too, because all the distinctions are going to collapse. And all
they have collapsed.
Yeah.
They have collapsed. Is I would say what's going on now with the butchering of children for trans identity. That's evil.
Yes.
So there's evil going on for sure.
And as a Christian, I would just note that Timothy, was it Timothy? I can't remember the reference, but people will tell you what your itching ears want to hear, and that they will call good evil and evil good. Actually, let me just make sure I've got that reference right, because it wasn't Timothy. I don't know why.
Yeah, well, things are upside down. There's no doubt about it. That's what Jonathan Pageau says. Everything's upside down.
Yeah. Isaiah 5:20. Woe to them that call evil good and good evil. And then, 2 Timothy 4:3. Instead, they will live by their own desires. They'll scratch their itching ears by surrounding themselves with teachers who approve of their lifestyles. People are going to look for people that tell them what they want to hear. And
that's
if that doesn't describe the reality we're in, where you must affirm everything that I want to do.
Yeah, right.
So what I'm hoping is that everyone sees that what Baudrillard is looking at the world and saying, we've been so saturated with symbols and representation and media and images that we've lost sight of what's real, and we're just playing in the system of representations. And eventually, when those representations aren't hooked to anything anymore, the representations themselves are just kind of free floating. There's nothing to hold them in place. And when that happens, all of the distinctions, hierarchies, all of that breaks down. The difference between good and evil breaks down. All of our criteria breaks down. Our notions of truth break down. Everything breaks down. All of the categories that we live by in modernity just simply don't apply and don't work when everything is happening in the discursive realm, in the realm of discourse, of signs, of symbols, of mass media. And Baudrillard thinks that this is where we are now, and we're stuck with it. I think he's kind of wrong about that, because I think that the iron law is that which can't continue won't. And this can't continue like this. People,
no.
Recently, when Jazz Jennings first showed up, that's a perfect example of a simulacrum, because they had this wonderful book where Jazz Jennings, who was born male, is a male, but had the surgeries as a teenager.
Yeah.
Put perfect makeup on and had the perfect haircut and had the nicest clothes and got a book and had the picture smiling on the cover of the book. And now those surgeries have not gone well, and there have been numerous complications. And they gave Jazz Jennings a TV show. I think it was on TLC or Life or one of these networks. And now it's a bit harder to hear from Jazz Jennings. Jazz Jennings' life isn't going so well. The last time I saw a picture of Jazz Jennings or a clip, Jazz talked about being despondent, depressed, unhealthy, morbidly overweight, several complications. There will be, if I've understood correctly, no ability to have any kind of orgasm or sexual pleasure when older.
Yeah, that's
right. This is what was all of this done in the name of affirming a notion of gender identity in a world where all the distinctions have been collapsed anyway.
Yeah.
This is a heinous moral evil that has been done. And
agreed.
And I would remind our friends in America that there is a difference between what can be done and what should be done.
Right.
And I would also like to help them to understand that there's a difference between liberty on one hand and autonomy on the other. And an attempt to gain liberty by aiming at autonomy is not going to go well. just because you say, well, it's my body, I can do such and so, doesn't mean it's a good thing and doesn't mean your choice should be welcomed and affirmed. That's not how societies ought to function. There needs to be things that are stigmatized, that we as a society say this is not good, that we warn
there needs
people
to be
away
things
from.
that are idealized, right? There needs to be the idealized, the best has to be identified. There's going to be people who don't, no one is going to meet the ideal, but there has to be an ideal.
Yes.
And the ideal is what was, is men and women created equal in the eyes of God. That is the ideal.
Correct.
And we have to keep that in mind. Otherwise, it fractionates how it has fractionated.
Yeah. One of the things that's gone on with concepts, and Jordan and John Peugeot have been talking about this kind of nonstop. In my last conversation with Jonathan and Paul, I didn't bring this up.
Mm-hmm.
I have a tendency to overtalk, and I got lost.
You're all right. Don't worry about it.
But in my discussions of Searle, one of the things that Searle points out is that one of the games that the postmoderns play is that they say, well, give me a definition of man or woman, and you give them one, and they find some obscure borderline case. And Searle talks about this, and one of the things that Searle says is that we don't have any concepts that have exact borders and no marginal cases. He says that's just not right. That's just impossible. And he says what you actually have is, he says, all of our concepts will have marginal cases. And in Speech Acts in 1969, he was doing, there's two concepts in philosophy, the analytic and synthetic divide, which occurred in, or the difference between analytic and synthetic sentences. I don't want to get into the big explanation of that, but a philosopher named Quine gave an example and said, you guys don't have a clear distinction between those. Your definitions aren't clear, because here is an example that's on the line. He gave an example of a statement that could be considered from one view analytic and from one view could be thought synthetic. And Searle came along and said, look, I don't really know if the synthetic or analytic divide is really useful, but the fact that you could find an example that was on the line between the two means that you know where the line is. You're perfectly clear about where the line is. That's how you knew to pick that example. He says, you're perfectly clear. When you give counterexamples to my notion of analyticity, or when you give counterexamples to my notion of woman, the only reason you're able to give a counterexample is because you know what my notion of woman is. You're perfectly clear about this. You're totally clear. Right. So then they try to escape you and say, well, hold on. There's no category in reality. Those categories are in your head. Well, maybe. But nature does have, there are certain reproductive functions which are required for society to go on. And we can look at those reproductive functions and say, look, those who do, would, or can have testes, and those who could, would, or do have ovaries, that's your basic biological divide. That's the core of your concept. And then the other things around it. So what are the things that are typically associated with the testicle havers and the things that are typically associated with the ovary havers? Typically, those form your first concentric ring around your core. And then you have concentric rings that go all the way out, and things that are less important to the concept as it gets to the edge. And what Searle says is, look, we have all kinds of concepts that are fuzzy at the edges. He says all concepts are. In fact, we have an entire science now of fuzzy logic to account for this. And it's called fuzzy logic. And he says that the postmoderns are doing is they're basically attacking a caricature of what concepts are by insisting that the concepts must be defined so clearly that there are no marginal cases. He says you can't do that. He says, the postmodernists...
Right. They bring in the margins to the middle.
Yeah. And he says, the only reason, if you say, well, we want to focus on the margin, the only way you can have a margin is if you have something at the center, which is a core. And he says that's the thing. That's
otherwise, there's no margin. Yeah.
And if you bring your margin to your center, what happens? That's like that's hollowing it out.
And then the margins are things that you can't tolerate because they go way too far.
That's right.
When you have the margins of the margins, then you've gone too far. It's not tolerated anymore.
But there's this kind of core margin discourse happens both in language, it happens in morality, it happens in our defining our categories in society. What do? We have to have certain ideals that people aim at. But there are also going to be people who don't fit that mold, and what do we do with those people? Okay?
We have to have tolerance for them.
Right.
That's what we do. Mm-hmm.
But what we don't want to do is take those people who are like, I want LeBron James to be held up as an ideal. But LeBron James is the ideal. He's not the center. He's an ideal. He's outside of the center because he's held up as the ideal because he's a superior basketball player. Same with Michael Jordan. Those are guys we hold up as ideals. There aren't a bunch of men walking around living like LeBron James. He's not the center. Right? That's not where the center of gravity of our society is. It's guys like him. It's guys like the electrician across the road or the plumber. And so the game that they play with language, and Searle pointed this out so beautifully, is to demand that there be categories given that have no marginal cases. And he says that's impossible for reasons, and maybe we could talk about that, Searle's theory of language and why it completely obliterates postmodernism and why the entire postmodern milieu doesn't work. But that whole thing, that negotiation between the fringe and the center, is kind of at work in most of the postmodern world. And all of it is based on a series of fallacies, which we've known about for 40 years. It just seems we forgot them.
So you'll have to send me something to read on Searle, or tell me and I can get it.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I will send you some wonderful work on Searle. And he's
okay.
Unlike Baudrillard or Derrida or Foucault, Searle is a wonderfully clear writer.
Okay. But Baudrillard, I like that. I know that it's leads you down to a place of trouble, but it's worth discussing, that's for sure.
And his diagnosis, I don't like where it leads, but his diagnosis, he does get a lot right.
Right. Unfortunately.
Yeah. It's like, I hate to say it, but he's got a point.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much again.
Thank you for having me.